Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Field Advisor webinar. My name is Kelsey Litchfield, and I'm the Agronomic Outreach Specialist with Illinois Soybean Association, and I'll be your host for this session. So thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Steve Wilson and Dr. Trent Ford. Thank you both. I'll do some introductions and some quick housekeeping reminders, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Ford to begin. But before we dive in on this webinar, just to cover just a couple of housekeeping items for you all to know. First, this webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording along with the short survey will be sent out after the webinar, either today or tomorrow. We'll have that, and then the recording will also be on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to Field Advisor, just head over to YouTube, search Field Advisor, and you could subscribe there, and that has all the rest of our webinar videos if you'd like to view them. This webinar is offering one CEU credit in soil and water management. If you're watching live, a QR code for the credit will appear at the end of this presentation that you can scan. If you're watching the recording, we recommend self-reporting for the CCA credit. You can email fieldadvisor@ilsoy.org. That's FIELDADVISOR at ilsow.org, and we can help you with self-reporting if need be. Finally, if you have any questions, Lauren just put in the chat. If you have any questions, drop them there. If we have time during the presentation to ask them, we'll share them with our presenters, or we can save it to the end for the Q&A. All right, I think that's it. Let's get started. First, I'll do a couple of introductions. First, today we have Dr. Trent Ford. Dr. Ford is the Illinois State Climatologist and a leading expert in climate and climate change. Since joining the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois in 2019, he has focused on studying how climate and water interact and affect our communities. His work includes monitoring Illinois climate and drought conditions, leading data collection efforts, and collaborating with local communities, industries, and state agencies. Dr. Ford also shares his insights through online educational outreach, such as this webinar, and many of his own outreach channels as well. He is a native of Roanoke, Illinois, holds a bachelor's in geography from Illinois State University, and a master's and PhD from Texas A&M. So thank you, Dr. Ford. And then after Dr. Ford, we'll have Steve Wilson, a groundwater hydrologist at the Illinois State Water Survey. Steve brings more than 35 years of experience in groundwater, drinking water, and water quality issues across Illinois and the U.S. He is the creator of the Private Well Class, an online program guiding private well owners and professionals on well maintenance and safety. Steve holds 3 degrees from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Engineering, a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Science, and a Master of Science in Civil Engineering. He also has a long history in agriculture, having been named the Star State Farmer for Section 14 in Illinois FFA in 1982. So great to see that connection as well. So thank you, Steve, for taking time today. All right, Dr. Ford, I'll hand it over to you to share your screen and get us started.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Kelsey and Lauren. And thanks everybody here for giving us part of your busy days, especially as we're coming up to this really busy season. Let me share the screen here. Make sure that everyone can see it. We're going to go through the typical Zoom thing here where I ask you if you can see that, and then I put it in full screen, then I ask you again. Everything look okay?
Yep, looks
All
great.
right. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So we're going to talk about 2024 a little bit. Now, as far as climate and weather, what climate and water are concerned, some trends that 2024 kind of portends to, and then 2025 a little bit, at least the first half or so. So this was sort of the kind of uh pattern that we had was early season dryness across much of the state in 2024, especially April and then May. Statewide were we only got about 60 to 70% of normal precipitation. Now, it was a little bit more variable. You know, we had some folks in northern Illinois and far southern Illinois that got a decent amount of rain during those periods of time, but it certainly wasn't a washout necessarily consistently, especially in May. And so what that meant was that field work, not just in Illinois, but across the region, got off to a pretty good start. Now, every time I say something like that, like, oh, it was a good year, or we got a good start in, or we harvested early, there's always a few people are like, well, I didn't because my field got washed out. And my condolences if that was the case. But in general, in aggregate, we could see, you know, as of towards the end of May, we were 14, 15% above normal as far as soybeans planted. So, as far as like water was concerned, we had a fairly wet winter, so we weren't looking at carrying drought necessarily into the spring. But that dryness was definitely in stark contrast to some of the extremely wet springs that we've had in recent memory, like 2019. And so that did at least facilitate somewhat of a timely start to the growing season. We also had a really warm start to 2024. And actually, I should say it isn't just a start, it is it's continued with one interesting departure in the summertime that I'll get to in a second. So, 2024 is likely in many places going to be the warmest year on record across Illinois. Is definitely going to be that way in Chicago and Peoria. Top five pretty much everywhere else, and most of that actually is because of the very warm start to the season. So, the plot on the right, these are temperature departures between January and May. So for the first full 5 months of the year, we were anywhere between 2 and 7 degrees above normal, and you can see the largest departures in northern Illinois. And so that really, as you would expect, it really got soil temperatures rolling very early. So I have our 4-inch soil temperature measurements here in Champaign. Actually, it's the station right behind my office here at the Illinois Climate Network. And the red line here going from January to the beginning of May shows 2024 4-inch bare soil temperatures compared to the black line of kind of where we are, the average. And then these gray lines are like different years. And you know, for much of February, March, and even April, we were the only year that we were behind as far as soil temperatures are concerned was 2012, and that was just because that was an ungodly warm late winter, early spring. So, you know, we hit here in Champaign, we hit and sustained above 50-degree soil temperatures, second earliest on record, only lagging behind 2012. So, warm start to the season meant that those soils were, it wasn't just that the soils were dry enough to work in most places, but they were warm enough for planting as well pretty early on. And you know, these are temperature patterns, temperature departures from normal. Anywhere you see red or orange, we were warmer than normal. Green was cooler than normal, and this is for summer. And so June kind of sustained the warmth that we had from January to May. And then in the most critical time of the growing season in July and then into August, we actually cooled down. Now it wasn't cool necessarily, right? It's still July and August in Illinois, but you can see July statewide, we were 1 to 3 degrees below normal as far as our temperatures, and August was like right at the normal. So as I mentioned, 2024 had this weird temperature pattern where we were much above normal early. That kind of critical mid to late growing season, we were actually a bit cooler than normal, and then the heat turned back on in the relatively speaking in the fall, and really has continued since then. And so I mentioned midsummer cooled off. It also got pretty wet. We were dry, fairly dry through much of May and June. And then we got very wet in July. You can see this map here is summer, the entire summer, June through August, precipitation departures from normal. It's kind of all over the place, but generally speaking, what this is showing is that most places had near to slightly above normal precipitation during the summertime. A couple places like down near the Metro East, up in kind of north central Illinois, around the Peoria area were much wetter than normal, thanks to some pretty heavy precipitation events, and I'll talk about those in a second here. But in general, again, it was one of these patterns where we had warm and dry early, and then cooler, not cool again, it was July, but cooler and pretty wet in the mid part of the growing season. And then we got again warmer than normal and dry again in the late part of the growing season. And if you were one of these people who got dry during planting, wet when you needed it, and dry during harvest, this was a fantastic year. If some of the progress on the soybeans missed those windows of opportunity, then it may have been a bit of a more of a struggle. I mentioned the soil moisture conditions here. This is showing soil moisture in DeKalb at our station in DeKalb. The blue line is this year going from April to October. The black line in each of these plots is kind of the average where we typically are. So what you can see here is that, I mean, in DeKalb at 4 and 8 inch depths, our soil moisture plummeted in May and June. And that's because we just didn't get much rain in northern Illinois. And we were looking at some pretty dry topsoils. Now, in DeKalb, our water table levels at this station are like 5 feet below ground. So it doesn't get dry very deep very easily. But at least in the topsoil, it was pretty dry. And then we got that July rainfall that just shot it back up. And we've been hovering around normal since that time. So, like I mentioned, it was dry early, big rain in July, helped get some moisture into the ground. We've kind of just hovered around normal since then. So this is kind of the overall picture is that timely summer rain kept drought at bay. You can see these are drought monitor maps on July 2nd. We had some drought hanging around in Western Illinois where it just seems to be kind of an everlasting thing. And then in East Central Illinois as well. Rains took care of a lot of that drought. Really, the map was pretty clear by July 23rd. And so again, that kind of timely rains. You know, it wasn't, it's not going to go down in statewide as a record wet summer. A couple places we may see that, but it was, you know, the timely rains that was really important. And I have this dot 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 kept drought at bay until the fall. And so you can see the kind of the evolution of these drought monitor maps. By the time we hit Halloween, we had moderate to severe drought pretty much everywhere north of I-70 and some severe drought up in northwest and kind of east central Illinois. And that's just because it just simply did not rain north of I-70 in September and October. So I mentioned the dryness and the warmth to start the year, some timely rain, maybe a little bit too much rain in July, and then dryness around harvest as well. Now, I will say again, depending on where you are in the state, your growing season differs. You know, your results may vary a bit, and that's kind of always the case. You can see in September here. Again, I-70 really splits the wet and the dry for September precipitation departures, which are on the left. So anywhere on North I-70, we were, you know, 1 to 4 inches below normal as far as September. This area down here in Southern Illinois, this is mostly from the remnants of Hurricane Helene. So it wasn't that September was excessively wet. It was just we got the remnants of that tropical storm and dropped a decent amount of rain. And so harvest started in northern and central Illinois, actually right around the same time that we saw harvest start in southern Illinois. And so we were way ahead of schedule in northern Illinois and a lot of northern Illinois. In southern Illinois, it was sort of right on time, if not just slightly delayed. But you can see here that in the aggregate for the state, again, just like planting for harvesting, you know, mid-October, we were 20 percentage points ahead of the 5-year average as far as soybeans harvested. And I mean, I saw a few beans coming out in the beginning of November, but I don't know if that was just recreational fields or what. But most folks, at least around here in Champaign, had everything out by late October. So again, as I mentioned, kind of wet, or excuse me, dry, warm early. Got some July rains, a little bit excessively so in some parts, and then dry for harvest for the most part. And you know that sort of equation of dry, wet, dry definitely had us for the most part statewide had been kind of progress ahead of normal. So you can see the progress years here for planted, for blooming, for setting pods, for dropping leaves, for harvested. You know the solid lines here, which is this year, were far ahead of the 5-year average. They weren't necessarily far ahead of 2023. You know, 2023, if you can remember back, especially for planting, April was just bone dry. So folks were getting beans in like they were going out of style. But certainly, as far as this year, we were ahead of the 5-year average in pretty much every phenological stage, and certainly for harvest. As you can see, we were well above 90% harvested across the state by the time we hit Halloween. So that warm, dry, cooler, wet, warmer, drier, that was a again, for a lot of folks, not a bad pattern to be in. Since then, the map on the left is precipitation. Since that time, the map on the right is temperature departure. So we've been a little bit cooler. I mentioned the warmth in October. We've been a little bit cooler since mid November. We're going to have a happy Torchmas coming up in a week when Christmas Day temperatures are probably going to be in the 40s and 50s, but then it looks like it may cool down after that. So December will probably end pretty close to normal. It hasn't been particularly wet in much of the state. Southern Illinois over the last few days has picked up another good 2 to 3. Well, I don't know if it's good, but it's 2 to 3 inches of rain. Um, and kind of kept some emerging dryness at bay there. We've seen some emerging dryness in northern and central Illinois, but it's really nothing to be concerned about at this point. Our topsoils are a little bit drier than normal right now, and mostly entirely unfrozen. But our deeper layer soil moisture is right typically where it normally is. Streams are a little lower, but that's more of a legacy of how dry September and October was. So there's really no concern right now or not much concern with drought conditions. Looking ahead, these are the outlooks for winter, climatological winter, December, January, February. On the left is temperature, on the right is precipitation. Pretty much for the whole state, we're looking at not much indication of necessarily warmer or colder consistently temperatures in the wintertime. The way that I see this left map here, the way that I want to interpret this is to say that we're sort of maybe in some La Nina conditions. La Nina is having commitment issues. It's not deciding if it wants to be an actual La Nina or not. But either way, the Climate Prediction Center is hedging that even if it's not officially a La Nina-like conditions in the Pacific may affect our winter weather. And if that's the case, this temperature pattern is pretty much spot on with La Nina. Warmer across the southern U.S., colder in the northern U.S. What that means for us is better shots of colder air. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be bone chilling for the entirety of winter, or we're going to have a winter like we've had in the last few years where it's just been above normal temperatures, but a lot of variability, shots of cold air, maybe some snow depending on when that cold air arrives with precipitation. But I think variability is probably the name of the game for this winter, and that's sort of what CPC is showing here as well. So expect cold, expect some winter weather, probably periods of more moderate temperatures as well. Fairly common for an Illinois winter. As far as precipitation is concerned, that's a map on the right. This green blob here across the Great Lakes is indicating, again, very La Nina-esque kind of conditions, above normal precipitation for winter this year. That's something that it's probably not a bad thing. We do, like I mentioned, have some drier topsoil conditions. Streams, especially across the northern half of the state, are pretty much are pretty low right now. Stream flow is so we have some capacity. If we get winter rain on unfrozen soil, get winter rain on frozen soil, and we get the runoff. If we get snow that melts pretty quickly, we have a lot of capacity in the top 10, 20 inches of the soil and the streams to take that in. So at this point, for at least the next couple months, flooding risk should be pretty minimal. We'll see what we come out in February, March as, but overall, this above average temperature or above average precipitation signal means that it's unlikely we're going to carry much drought through the wintertime. And this the right map here is showing precipitation outlooks for spring, which is March through May. Again, above average, very La Nina-esque. There may be questions about spring field work and planting and excessively wet soils. There's way too much that's unknown at this point to say anything about what the spring planting season will look like. I want to mention that, this kind of a season like what we had, where it was a little bit dry, but everybody kind of enjoyed the dryness in April, and then again, and maybe in September and October to get field work done. We got some good July rains, and then some people got too much July rain, and depending on where you are, all of this variability across any growing season, it makes it really important for me to understand what's going on out there as far as drought conditions are concerned, as far as water conditions are concerned. And my office is here in Champaign. I try to get out across the state as much as possible, but it can be challenging. And even if you drive somewhere, doing some highway scouting, it's not necessarily the best way of understanding what's going on across the state. So one thing that I like to encourage people to use, and for those who are CCAs, encourage your clients and colleagues to use, is the Condition Monitoring Observer Report System, or CMOR system, which is through the National Drought Mitigation Center. We have the QR code here because I'm up with the times and I put QR codes in my talks, but we also have the URL here. And what this system does is folks can put in anonymous reports of just what's going on with drought conditions. Are you seeing drought impacts? Things look okay. And what it does is and you can attach photos too, but what it does is it goes to this database that's publicly available, so that when I'm doing my week-to-week drought monitoring with our drought monitoring team across the state, to keep state agencies, federal agencies, and the drought monitor folks sort of up with what's going on in Illinois, and making sure that the drought monitor and other systems are actually responsive to drought changes in the state. These condition monitor reports can be really helpful in understanding what's going on, and if we're either missing something or maybe got it right on with the drought monitor. So if you do look at the drought monitor, or you hear from folks that are looking at the drought monitor, and they have issues with it, this isn't right. This is getting it wrong. We're too dry here, or we're not dry enough here, whatever it may be. This is a great way to. You can always email me and say, hey, idiot, you got this wrong, which is fine. That helps me. But then you can also put in these more anonymous reports of what's going on. I'm showing examples here from 2023. We got a lot of reports 2023 during the drought, kind of all in the I-74 corridor. This is probably just me bothering all my family that lives between Champaign and Bloomington Normal about putting in reports. But these are really helpful. Now, I showed an example here of somebody from St. Clair County down near St. Louis that gave me a report of mildly dry, and then they gave me a reason why they think it's mildly dry in June of 2023. They said grass has slowed growth. It looks like July, but it's June. It's pretty dry here, that sort of thing. That's again, this seems like it may not be all that helpful, but in fact it is. And these information goes directly to help with the updates to the drought monitor. So like I mentioned, definitely encourage folks to kind of explore CMOR and put in reports if you're seeing things in the area that you're operating in. All right, the last little bit that I wanted to cover here is you're going to get a YouTube commercial. Unfortunately, I'm not getting any kind of kickback from this. It's just I'm trying to pull in a YouTube video and it comes with commercials. So here we are. What this is showing is drone footage in Nashville, in Washington County, in the middle of July, and you can see that spillway and that dam that was not over top, but was released to mitigate any kind of damage to the dam from really heavy rainfall that happened there. And on the left, this is a map of radar image from that storm. And this is the kind of the last point that I want to talk about in my talk here, is changing rainfall rates. We're getting heavier rain across the state of Illinois, across really the entire Midwest. And as you would expect, it causes issues with flooding as well as other issues. This is a really good example of what we're talking about when we talk about heavier rain, this storm that happened in mid-July this year. If you go back to July 15th, the National Weather Service office in St. Louis put out a sort of an advisory of the potential for heavy rain in this region. So from that standpoint, this event was pretty well forecast. But unfortunately, when it comes to heavy rainfall events, and not just in the St. Louis area, but all across the state, this type of event is really hard to predict where exactly the heavy rain is going to fall and how much is going to fall. our models, our weather forecast models do an okay job with that, but they certainly can't predict exactly where that rain is going to fall. So we can say, yeah, we have a chance of getting 4 or 5+ inches across the St. Louis area. But if you're an emergency manager in Madison County or a farmer in Monroe County, that makes a huge difference whether that falls in Edwardsville or Waterloo. So when it comes to actionable forecasts, we're still really missing a lot of those. And this thunderstorm did what's called training, where you have a really heavy storm cell that's dropping 1 to 2 inches of rain per hour. And in the middle of July, that's not rare to have that across the state. But oftentimes those storm cells are kind of like sub-county level. So and they're moving fast. So, you get a storm cell, it's dropping 2 inches an hour of rain, but it's only over you for 10 minutes. So you pick up a quarter of an inch, no big deal. The storm is gone or it dissipates. Unfortunately, with this kind of storm, when you get the training dynamics, what that means is you get one storm cell, it drops a quarter of an inch, moves on. Then the next one comes up behind it, drops a quarter of an inch, moves on, so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, you get that kind of dynamic for an hour or two, and you look up, and all of a sudden, you've caught 6 inches of rain in 2 hours, and that's when we start to see some of the really heavy precipitation. Like I mentioned, those kind of dynamics of when storms are going to train, where they're going to train, how much exactly how much rain is going to fall, where the flooding is going to be. Those are really hard predictions to make more than just an hour or two ahead of time. And unfortunately, with our changing climate, what we're seeing is that these storms that happened, you know, they're part of our natural climate are dropping even more rain. So mainly thanks to this event, we had the wettest July on record in Monroe County, and Edwardsville up in Madison County is approaching its top 5 wettest year on record. They already have 55 inches of rain or precipitation this year. So definitely some pretty big impacts. And what we see, and from flooding, the impact of these type of heavier rainfall events is more runoff. Heavier rainfall, even with the same amount of total rainfall, induces more runoff. That increases peak stream flow, which means it increases the risk of riverine flooding, but it also increases the risk of flooding outside of floodplains because you have stormwater drainage systems or other types of human infrastructure, like this dam, for example, that just can't handle the heavy rainfall. In agricultural areas, issues with nutrient runoff and soil erosion are major issues, and as well as sedimentation in our rivers and streams. From a drought standpoint, it also means that water that's falling is less effective at recharging soil moisture. So I'll show an example again from the St. Louis area a couple of years ago. But when you go from dryness to heavy rain to dryness, like what we did this year, right? I mean, April, May, to a lesser extent, June were pretty dry. All of a sudden, you get 6 inches of rain in 2 days in July. Well, great, but you're not actually netting that in the ground. So not only is it eroding the soil, it's taking nutrients and herbicides and other types of chemicals that you need on the field out with it and making those applications less effective. But it also means that all that runoff is not soaking into the soil. And so that water is not there when your plant needs it for dryness afterward. So just as an example, these small changes in rainfall intensity that we're experiencing, they produce thousands of gallons of additional runoff from just 1 acre of ag land. So it really makes a huge difference. And when you multiply all of that effect by a land cover change in, for example, the Kaskaskia River Basin, it makes a difference. I mentioned the issues with heavy rainfall, nutrient loss. We've seen that with the nutrient loss reduction strategy reports that we're still fighting this issue of nitrogen loss in our waterways, and climate is moving the goalpost on this. Unfortunately, we're doing a lot when it comes to infield and edge of field practices to reduce nitrate loss, but with heavier rains, it means that even more has to be done to mitigate those kind of losses. And of course, a lot of this is focused on the water quality problem, which is an issue, but there's an economic problem to this too. Input costs are not going down anytime soon, and so if your inputs are having less effect than ideal, then it just means a lower overall profitability for the farm. So this is an issue not just for environmental concerns, but economic concerns as well. And just to highlight results from some research done by Maren Skidmore and co-authors here at the University of Illinois, talking about ammonia concentrations, and this is for surface water in southern Wisconsin. But the similar kind of patterns apply for Illinois, where we see significant increases in ammonia concentration up to 2 weeks following a rainfall event of just 1 inch. Now, that, I mean, 1 inch, we don't even consider that all that heavy, let alone the 6 or 7 inches that some parts of the state got in a short period of time. So, again, I mentioned the economic issues, but of course, environmental issues as well. And then some of our surface water bodies having to be dredged because of that sedimentation from the soil erosion that comes from that as well. So this is a challenge. Having heavier rain, more increased precipitation intensity, it's definitely a challenge that we're likely going to continue to try to manage. I mentioned the example from St. Louis. In 2022, St. Louis had its sixth wettest summer on record, and those records stretch back to the 1860s, and they're a long time. But so it looked like a nice wet summer, but in fact, 2/3 of that entire summer rainfall came in just 2 days. So it was dry, 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 dry. Boom, we get lots of rain, and then dry, dry, dry after that, and it's just not the ideal kind of hydro climate conditions that you'd want to grow any crop, let alone soybeans that don't like wet feet, but also need a little bit of water through the growing season. So in this case, we had soybean fields that were getting to the point of being a little too dry in July of 2022. Then all of a sudden they have submerged roots for a week or two, and it's just again not ideal conditions. So managing that water is in a sustainable way is a major challenge moving forward. It's always been a challenge in Illinois, but it's not going away anytime soon. When it comes to the flip side, drought is complicated when it comes to changes in drought. I'll say that overall, the state has experienced less frequent long-term drought than what we saw in previous decades, like the 50s and 60s. But that increase in evaporation that we've seen because of higher summer temperatures means that we can move into drought much more quickly. So I show the two kind of side-by-side drought monitor maps here, one from May 16th of last year and the other one from June 27th. So we're only talking about 5 weeks difference. And I show two examples, two photos from my property. Here's my front lawn in mid-May. The grass looks okay, but it shouldn't really look like this in mid-May. It should be a lot greener. This is like late July kind of grass. But it's turf grass, right? Its roots are like 2 inches deep. So I expect it to look like that. It just means less mowing for me. But unfortunately, we went from this, grass doesn't look so great, but everything else is fine too. A stock pond is way below normal, and we lost our admittedly not very nice, but still at that time usable dock because of how far the groundwater conditions drop. So it was one of these things where again, this is only 5 weeks difference here between these images, and so this is something that we've seen with, again, we're not seeing as frequent long-term drought, but drought can move rapidly because of those increased evaporation rates. So it's not just managing the water when we have too much of it, but making sure we have sufficient water supplies and the root zone soil moisture, following those, during those periods of kind of prolonged dryness. So this is my last slide, kind of a summary of everything I've talked about here. 2024 growing season overall, we had a dry and warm start in general, which got, in general, a jump on spring field work. Timely July rains. In some cases, folks got a little bit too much, plus a lack of extreme heat. That was definitely the case. It was a bit cooler in July. We actually had a few nights that the temperature dropped into the 50s in northern Illinois, which was kind of pleasant. We had a very dry 6 week span in September, late September into October, which helped with a timely, if not early harvest, and dry down as well. For winter and spring, our outlook is wet pretty much from December through April. Our trend is also for wetter winters and springs. Plus, we have La Nina, which adds kind of that maybe La Nina-esque conditions. So that adds some confidence that it's likely we're going to be wetter than normal through April. The winter temperature pattern is likely going to be variable. No surprise there. There will be cold and snow. I'm just going out on a limb and telling you that winter in Illinois will be cold and there will be snow. So that's what you're paying me for here. But overall, the outlooks really tell us that it's likely not going to be this consistent above average temperatures this winter, that there'll be a lot more variability. Anybody who tells you anything about spring field work and planting is lying, because there's just not enough known about that yet. But we'll have to monitor what soil conditions look like as we move into February. Beyond that, nothing interesting or noteworthy for summer yet. But I will say that again, just hinting on this note here of these trends, that we've been getting warmer in Illinois. We've been getting wetter. And I think the warmer and wetter trends are highlighted often, but the more variable precipitation, I think, is something that has probably the largest impact when it comes to, farming in Illinois, whether it be beans or other crops. Dealing with those swings in moisture, shifting timelines, having new experiences. We've never seen it be this dry or this wet. We've never seen it get this dry this quickly. I've never seen my tile not flow in September. We've never seen this pest come this early or this late. None of these, all of these experiences are things that I hear from people around the state, but none of these are are insurmountable. It's just dealing with a change in climate means having these new experiences and managing them as best as we can. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve, and just again, thanks everybody for your time here.
All right. Hear me okay? And see my slides okay?
Looks good.
All right. So yeah, Steve Wilson, I'm with the State Water Survey. We're also with Trent. Um, I'm going to talk about water use today and our water inventory program, which is how we track high capacity water use in the state. So the water inventory program, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history here. It started at the Water Survey in 1978 as a voluntary program. It was meant to be a way to catalog and characterize how the water use in the state, especially high capacity water users, industrial, commercial, public, and irrigation. And so in the Water Use Act was established in 1983, but in 2010 it was amended, and those amendments made it mandatory for reporting water use to us for industrial, commercial, self-supplied industries, and the public water supplies, all the community water supplies in the state. That began in 2010, and for irrigation, it was 2015 to give folks time to get acclimated to that process. We use that data. The reason we started collecting it in the first place is because it supports all the scientific work that the Water Survey does. Groundwater modeling, understanding water level changes, and how pumpage affects those things, even water wells. The Water Use Act originally included areas of the state where if there were impacts from pumpage, then some other state agencies got involved. And I want to make it clear, the Water Survey is not a regulatory agency. We were under DNR, we still weren't regulatory. Since 2008, we've been at the University of Illinois. And so we have no regulatory authority. We are just named in the act to collect this data because we use it for scientific work and to understand what's going on in the state. So this here. So what IWIP does is it basically collects point data. And by point data, we mean from an individual well or an individual intake on a river or stream. And so there's, again, three types: public water supplies, which are all the community water supplies in the state, is defined through the Safe Drinking Water Act. Then self-supplied industrial commercial, that's any factory, nursery, golf course. We consider them industrial commercial. As far as irrigation goes, we're looking at just agricultural, typical center pivot, that type of irrigation. And the way the law is written, it's any well or series of wells that pump 100,000 gallons a day, which is about 70 gallons a minute from a single well. An example of what that, how that is meant to be: Atlanta, Illinois, has a very minimal producing aquifer in their area. And so for a long time, they had 10 or 12 wells that all pump 15 to 20 gallons a minute that supplied their water supply for the city of Atlanta, which, if you're not familiar, it's between Springfield and Bloomington on I-55. And so together they do pump more than 70 gallons a minute. And so they were identified as someone who needed to report. So push the wrong button there. Okay. The third part is irrigation, which is of most interest probably today. It's really, again, focused on ag as far as large capacity, not a small, not golf courses that are commercial, those sorts of things. It became mandatory in 2015. There's no teeth in the law. There's no requirement. If somebody doesn't report, there's no penalty. And because of that, we've seen less than 20% reporting since the program began. And even before that, we've had some irrigators, usually larger farmers who've provided information to us since the beginning, since the early 80s, and others and around the state is very inconsistent. And the one area where we have more data would be the Imperial Valley Water Authority, which is Mason and 6 townships in Tazewell County. And you can see from this graph, this is a reported pumpage that they provided going back to 94 or 95. That's because they estimate it based on electric use. And because of Menard Electric, which is an electric cooperative in the area, they had basically there's an equation that equates kilowatt hours to the amount of water being used. It's not perfect, but it allows them to understand how trends are changing. And you can see from this graph, every year is a little different. Trent mentioned, Monroe County, I think, is going to have 55 inches of rain this year. Well, in some years, like in 2009, all the rainfall was in the summer in Mason County. And so they used so much less than 2 years later in 2012, or 3 years later, when it was so dry. They used 98 billion gallons of water over the summer from those pivots. And so, the timing of rainfall, certainly in an area like that where it's really sandy soil, makes a difference on pumpage, but on average, they're trending up because there's more land being irrigated today than there was in the 90s in that area. So this is what irrigation looks like in Illinois. There are about 7,500 center pivots, and this map was very timely and time-consuming to make. We had to use aerial photos from USDA and actually go all around the state and zoom into those areas and determine where there were pivot irrigation systems. Obviously, Mason County, which is there in the center, and the Imperial Valley Water Authority area is the lowlands and bottomlands of the Illinois River. It's all very sandy soil. And so you really need to have irrigation there to grow a crop. And that's the case in most of the state where the water moisture holding capacity of the soil is low. That's typically where you see more irrigation, although that's not always the case. We have areas like in Champaign County where the soil's a little better, but they're still irrigating to protect their crop. A lot of times that's because of contracts with seed companies. And so, the difference here is that's a lot of irrigation, but we get 38 inches on average, and Trent can correct me if I'm wrong there. I'm normalizing over the whole state of rainfall a year, where Nebraska, for instance, gets 12 to 15 inches of rain. And that makes a huge difference in why there's so many more pivots in those areas. So focusing on Imperial Valley, just as an example, about 30% of all the irrigated acreage in the state is in Mason and Tazewell County. And again, the Imperial Valley is Mason County plus 6 townships, or part of 6 townships in Tazewell County. That's about 2,300 irrigation systems. And again, in 1990 or in 2012, they pumped 98 billion gallons of water. If you assume a growing season of between 120 and 130 days or whatever, where they're going to be using that pivot, that's nearly 1 billion gallons a day being pumped from that area alone. So again, the average has been more closer to 50. And this is part of the Muhammad Aquifer. Boy, sorry, 1 second. Should not have tried to take a drink.
That's okay. Take your time.
Man. Wow. I'm gonna have to take another drink. Excuse me. Well, that was a mistake. I was gonna say about the Muhammad Aquifer. This is the outfall, if you will, of the Muhammad, where the sand is at the surface. So the Muhammad Aquifer is actually land surface. Whereas in Champaign County, where we're at, it's buried underneath several glaciations of clay and sand. The Muhammad Aquifer in Champaign County starts about 200 feet below land surface. Wow. And that really makes a difference. So this is a well, man, this is a well, and those are water level lines and depth of water. So in November of 2011, the water level was about 27 feet below land surface. Then we had the drought, and San Jose is in Mason County, and you can see it's near a pivot. So every time the pivot turns on and off, that's why you see those up and down lines. Man, sorry. And then you can see what happens over time. Irrigation stopped near the end of August, and so water levels start recovering. There's irrigation the next year in 2013. It was a wetter year. So there wasn't as much pumpage, and if you remember, 2014 was a pretty wet year. So as we go through, there was only about 7 feet. I go back, there was only about 7 feet of drawdown, even during the drought. And with all that pumpage and all those pivots, that's a very prolific aquifer, but it's again at the surface. I am so sorry. But because it's a unconfined system, it's actually dewatering the sand. And so the sand above that is not at 100%, it's not saturated. Whereas in Champaign County, the St. Mahomet Aquifer, much fewer pivots in the Champaign area. And this is Trent Ford of Vermilion. But because it's a confined aquifer, it's under pressure. And so whenever you pump in an aquifer like that, you're actually taking pressure off the system. So drawdowns happen a lot faster. And so what we saw in 2012 and the years on both sides of that was that we had about 40 feet of drawdown from, a tenth of the number of pivots, much less water use, but it's because it's taking pressure off the system. That's not a big issue unless someone has a private well and their pump may not be set that deep. And some of these wells saw impacts in 2012. And boy, that really did it. Okay. So going back to the San Jose well, the graph on the left shows the last 5 years through this morning, 7 a.m. If you remember the water levels on the previous one I showed from around the drought in 2012, water levels between 27 and 34 feet below land surface. And you can see here, they started about 29, go up to 24, and then they've migrated down slowly. So it's really hard when you look at a certain data set to understand the big picture here. But I went back then, the picture on the right is the graph all the way back to 1995 when this data started. And you can see in 2011, water levels got up as high as only 22 feet below land surface. And then they dropped during the drought. And that's what we were looking at on that other graph. But if you take this whole picture, it would probably be fair to say the average water level in the Mahomet in Mason County over the last, 30 years is around 29 feet below land surface. And that obviously varies from location to location. We know down by Easton, water levels are 3 or 4 feet. Up by Forest City, they're as deep as 40 or 50 feet all the time, just the way the land surface is in those areas. But it gives you a snapshot of what happens when there's pumpage, when there's less rainfall or more rainfall in some of these areas. And so this data is really important to tie together. So we look at relationships for pumpage, drawdown, the water levels, and recharge, and how that impacts the overall availability of groundwater. And so it also tells us things about groundwater surface water interactions. We did some work in the 90s in the Kankakee area. We found areas of the Kankakee River that are both gaining or losing, which means some are putting water into the ground in the aquifers at that location. Others are discharging groundwater into the river. And so we can look at that information. So for instance, in 1988, the drought we had then in the Champaign area, the Sangamon River went dry. And it turns out that it's connected to the Mahomet through a series of complicated glaciation. And so what we saw there is when there's enough water in the Mahomet and there's normal rainfall and the river's flowing like it should be, it's discharging water into the Mahomet in some of those areas. But when when the water levels are high, excuse me, it's discharging to the river. But whenever water levels go down in the aquifer, then that changes the flow direction. And now the Sangamon was actually providing water to the aquifer enough that it went dry in some locations, like just south west of out of Monticello. And so, the aquifer doesn't care who's using the water or for what reason, but having this information and being able to track it over time allows us to look at these long-term trends and determine where we should be paying attention. That's like in 2012 during the drought, there was some well interference up by Paxton, Illinois. When we went to investigate that, it turned out in the Paxton area, they're actually flowing wells, and they weren't actually, there was plenty of water still in the aquifer and in the wells. It's just that they didn't flow anymore. And some homeowners didn't have pumps in their wells because they didn't need them, which is really interesting. But so all those things do matter. And this graph, so Python scripts here in the middle is basically our programming or modeling. But we take water quality data, water use data, water level data, and the geologic data, along with other field information we collect on aquifer properties. And we can use that then to investigate what might happen over time or the direction things are going in a given aquifer, what the sustainable yield is. And I'll get to that in a second. But understanding those things allow us to look at things proactively and not have something come up like where a well owner's well goes dry. And this happened with a quarry. The quarry kept moving along the Salt Creek in Logan County. And eventually they got close enough to a couple of homes that when they started pumping out to get to mine sand, they dewatered a couple wells. And in Illinois, it's the law of reasonable use, which means that farmer with a private well would have had to take them to court and prove that they had caused damage in order to get relief from that. Instead, we talked to them, we talked to the quarry, let them know that we believe that they were causing this problem, and they drilled the guy a new well and saved, court costs and lawyers and all those things. So it's a complicated system because we don't have a lot of water law in Illinois. But that's why it's good to know in advance what's going on, have a good handle on areas that might be a problem. And so it's really the core of what we do and why we collect data and have, the water survey is almost 130 years old. And we've been involved in this for a long time, not only for water supply planning and doing regional or local studies, but also for groundwater flow modeling, which allows us to predict what might happen. And water use and how much water is being pumped out is a critical piece of that because, it's mass balance. It's water in versus water out versus changes in water level that kind of dictate what's going on. So, for example, this is Illinois American. The red line is the pumpage from Illinois American water system, which is Champaign-Urbana's water provider for our public water supply. And there's a well that's a couple miles out west of town called Petro North that you can see what's happened to water levels there. They've dropped, and this is done by mean sea level. So the mean sea level elevation in 1953 was almost, was 646, let's say. And today, or it's about the same still today. It's around 590, 595. And that loss is directly relatable to the amount of pumpage they're pumping from their well field, which is only a few miles away. They pump 22 million gallons a day. It's been pretty level for the last 10 years or so. And so, but you can see the water levels are staying lower because they continue to pump. If for some reason the Illinois American were able to just shut off all their pumps, over time, this would eventually go back to its natural condition, which is somewhere above, 645. But that's the condition we've created here because of pumpage in the area. And this is the case everywhere when you're pumping. Seasonal pumpage can be different, as I showed earlier, but it all affects water levels and how much water is available for other uses. So I mentioned groundwater modeling and the relief or the importance of that. So before 1980, most of the Chicago area was on a deep sandstone aquifer, and they were pumping so much as Chicago grew that the sustainable yield of that aquifer is around 60 MGD or 65 MGD, and they were pumping nearly 180 MGD out of that aquifer. They lowered water levels over 1,000 feet. Soon it was going to be an unusable aquifer. So they started in 1980 using Lake Michigan, and they dropped their pumpage down to about 30 MGD on the deep sandstone. The other Great Lakes states in Canada sued Illinois. It was capped at 2.1 billion gallons a day is all that Illinois can take out of Lake Michigan. Still a lot of water, but in Chicago and the Chicago area has grown. It's now becoming a problem again. And as Joliet in that area is the last large area that actually uses groundwater. And now our modeling has indicated from all the work that we've done that that's where the red dot is, a red spot is in those two maps. That's where Joliet and industries nearby Joliet are. That by 2030, our modeling predicts that they're going to run out of water in the deep sandstone. So they've just signed an agreement with the city of Chicago to start getting water from them. And they're going to go off the deep aquifer, which you can see where it shows recovery on the bottom graph there. All the area around Chicago, it shows that it's gone up as much as 250 feet or so. That's because there's no pumpage there anymore, like there was before 1980. So these things really do matter. And in the big picture, understanding those things matters. And so if you're an irrigator, if you're not participating in the IWIP program, you can contact us. We'll get you started. We can answer any questions you have. There's an initial form to fill out. It's a well registration form. Any wells or intakes that you have, we'll work with you to verify those locations. Likely there's a well log for each of those. The state, the water survey houses those logs. They're all public information. And then it's really just a matter of submitting your water use, whether you have a meter, which most people don't, or if you estimate it based on whether you're diesel or electric, you can estimate the pumpage from that. There's a very long link here. You can just Google Illinois Water Inventory Program and get to that. And, you know, why report? It allows us to do things like we did with Joliet and also understand where there might be developing problems. Because eventually, if we had, Trent mentioned the 50s, we had a 2.5 year drought in the 50s. If we have a drought like that again, there's going to be water conflict and there's no water law per se. So somebody, a court, a judge, or some regulatory agency is going to decide what water law becomes in Illinois. And having data is probably the best way to make sure that there's an equitable solution there. I do want to mention we are not regulatory again. We're a scientific agency, and we do have protections in place to protect individual data. There's a thing you can sign that, to protect it from FOIA, all that sort of stuff. But without the data, we actually still estimate every high capacity well's water use. Our job is to understand how much water is being used in the state, and whether we have a full set of data or estimated data, we're going to estimate what we think it is. And so if we have the actual data, that makes those estimates obviously a lot better and more accurate. And so that's, it's really in everyone's best interest to report. So any questions? Yeah, I think that's all I have. I am Cora's boss. Cora is the IWIP coordinator. I'm not sure if she's on today, but I know Tanner Jones is. He is also with the IWIP program, but you can contact us or me at any of these, either of these numbers. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That was really good information. I do have a question for each of you. Steve, I'm going to start with you real quick. For those, such as myself, we do not have irrigation on our farm. I live in West Central Illinois. I don't see a lot where I'm at. But if someone's like me on this call, how can we help support the program? What can we do if we don't have direct use, or maybe we know of farmers or others that use it, but how can we help that maybe don't have a direct tie to it?
Sure. Well, I mean, just if you look at the information that's available and the things that the water survey does, it benefits everyone. And there's a current program going on that's funded by DNR. It's Illinois Water Supply Planning. We're actually going through around the whole state in sections. There's local interest groups that are being formed by DNR to local stakeholder groups to look at what water resources are available. and how they may want to, and just to have a better inventory of what's there, where there might be risks or some associated deficiencies in the amount of water available, all those sorts of things. So as an example, when all the ethanol plants were going in, this is 20 years ago or so, um, sometimes those went in place without considering water. And they bought land, there's a highway and a railroad, but if you don't consider that you need 2 million gallons a day for processing that, it's just a matter of getting the word out to everyone about if they have any intent on doing any kind of industry that's going to require water, to understand what your resources are. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
it's important to all of us, whether
Yeah.
you are on a city well, a private well, whatever it might be.
Yep. We're all users of water. And I think this information now, knowing it you can also now communicate it and have a conversation with someone and ask them, when you're talking about irrigation, to have a conversation about it. So
Yeah.
I think that this is very good background information to have, definitely. So thank you, Steve. uh Dr. Ford, one question I have for you, this derechos, the topic of derechos, which, forgive me for being someone maybe that doesn't have as much background, or I really just started paying attention to derechos in 2020 when they hit Iowa pretty bad. And then we were actually at a field day, excuse me, in 2023. We were down near Champaign and we were done with the field day outside, but we all rushed in because a derecho came through, and then another one hit this past summer. So for me, they seem to be becoming more common. That might not be accurate at all, but I'm curious, in your point of view, are they becoming more common? I mean, wind is a whole entirely different obstacle when it comes to weather, and it has potential to devastate areas. So that's my question for you about derechos.
Yeah, so just so we're on the same is a really good question. Just so we're on the same kind of playing ground here, where derecho is a series of really strong straight level winds. So they're not rotating like a tornado or anything like that. It's straight level winds that stem from a specific kind of convective thunderstorms. So um, the like you mentioned, they can be quite destructive, and two reasons why they're quite destructive. One is because they can bring winds up to and exceeding 120 miles per hour. I think Cedar Rapids, Iowa had a 140-mile-an-hour measurement for that derecho in 2020, and they can be long-lived. The derecho that came across Iowa started in South Dakota and ended in northern Indiana, and they can also they affect a very large area. So, like you mentioned, the 2023 derecho that affected you all your field day, that knocked out power to Springfield. But also affected a broad swath for really from the Quad Cities to Danville. So to your question of are derechos becoming more common, the jury's out. This area, Illinois, the Midwest more generally, is sort of derecho central. Climatologically, we get the most derechos of almost anywhere else in the world, certainly in the country. On average, one every other year. Although, like you've mentioned, we've seen a bit of a higher rate in the last few years. Um, there is not as much known about the relationship between climate change and the frequency and intensity of derechos. There's some evidence from recent modeling studies that suggest that they may become more intense. Not quite sure if it's more common, but it's really challenging. There's work being done right now here at the U of I and other places to try to better model those storms to try to understand their potential connection to climate change, but I don't really have good evidence or good data to share with you at this point. I will say, just shameless plug here, that for Extension's crop management conferences this year, my topic that I'm doing is going to be about wind, which will include derecho. I can't promise that I'm going to give you a clearer answer in those crop management conferences on wind, but we'll talk about because you're right, wind is one of those hazards that kind of gets overlooked until we have a really impactful event. So more to come on all that.
Yes, that's what I thought you would say. It's something that I think is becoming more at the forefront,
Mhm.
and something definitely to keep on top of, because it seems like every summer, maybe not impact your area, but somewhere else that it has. So,
That's right.
um,
Yep.
okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ford. Thank you, Steve. I believe that's all the time we have today. We went a little bit over, but that's okay. I think both of you gave really great presentations, something to ponder maybe over this holiday break. And these recordings will be available if you want to visit them again. I hope to have these up either today or tomorrow. So if you missed something, or I know they share their contact information, you can get a hold of them there. So thank you both very much. I appreciate both of you coming on today, taking the time to present and sharing some great impactful information about climate and water trends. So before we end, just a couple of quick reminders. Again, this webinar recording will be emailed out. If you need the CCA credits, Lauren did share the QR code. If you didn't scan it, or if you're watching the recording and need a credit, please email us at fieldadvisor@ilsoy.org for assistance. And then thank you, Lauren. Finally, mark your calendar for our next webinar on January 22nd in the new year. The title of this webinar is Biologicals. Are they a barrier or are they a game changer? Join Dr. Mallory Shudwar, Assistant Professor and Soil Microbiome Extension Specialist, all the way over at NC State University, as she explores the current practicality and promise of I always get this mixed up. Biostimulants. I may have said that wrong again. She will also discuss best practices for their use, and also we're going to talk about how to interpret and read labels, which I think is very important. Then also Dr. Laura Lindsay from Ohio State. She's going to talk about some common and more lesser known biostimulant seed treatments, and she's also going to share some field data that they did with the Science for Success program and its impact on soybean yield. So it's going to be a jam-packed webinar about biologicals. We know there's a lot of talk out there, so we wanted to bring some experts in to talk about the questions we have. Registration is now open. If you go to fieldadvisor.org and then go to the Attend tab under Webinars, you'll find the information there. And then before you go, stay connected to Field Advisor. Shameless plug I have to put on there. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter, YouTube. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram. You can find all those links and subscribe to our e-newsletter on fieldadvisor.org. All right, that's it. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.